We have seen that long division is crucial to study the ring of integers and polynomial rings in one variable over a field. We will define Euclidean domains by defining an abstract version of long division. Why is this useful? For one, we can do calculations with long division. For example, the Euclidean algorithm to calculate the GCD. Second, it is easy to see that Euclidean domains are PIDs. This gives a good way to show that a ring is a PID, and we get more PIDs this way. For example, the ring of Gaussian integers. We will also see that factorization in this ring is useful in analyzing the a square plus b square problem, which we stated at the start of this course. By the way, there are PIDs that are not Euclidean domains, but this fact is not so important. Euclidean domains are less important for their own sake. PIDs and UFDs are more important concepts, but Euclidean domains are still useful, so let's discuss them. We say that a domain D is Euclidean if there exists a size function sigma from non-zero elements of D to non-negative integers such that I can divide any B in the domain by any non-zero divisor D such that I get this equation. In other words, I get quotient Q and remainder R with the all-important condition that the size of the remainder must be less than that of the divisor or the remainder must be 0. We have already seen two important examples, integers with the absolute value function and polynomial ring in one variable over a field with the degree function. We will soon see this third example. At this point, it should be completely unsurprising that every ideal in a Euclidean domain is principal. I have written the proof over here, but there is nothing new in it, so you should be able to do it on your own. Every Euclidean domain is a PID, but the converse is not true. For example, this ring. How does one show something like this? You have to show that no size function will work and still prove that this ring is a PID. I have given a reference in the homework. Next, even when a sigma exists, it is not unique. For example, you can just compose with an increasing function on non-negative integers. And for a given sigma, quotient and remainder need not be unique, as you can check in this example. Okay, now try to prove that Gaussian integers do form a Euclidean domain. I have given you a size function, namely the square of the absolute value. So see if you can do this. This is nice and not difficult. Given Gaussian integers b and d, I first do this ordinary complex division to get real and imaginary parts s and t. Now I take integers closest to s and t, call them u and v, and I declare this Gaussian integer u plus vi to be the quotient. For the remaining part, I can calculate the square of its absolute value and see that it is at most equal to a half. Now, I multiply this equation by d to get b equals dq plus the remainder. Now, this remainder is a difference between two Gaussian integers, and so it too is a Gaussian integer. To calculate sigma of this, I use multiplicativity of absolute value and find that sigma of r is at most equal to sigma of d divided by 2. In particular, it is strictly less than sigma of d. This works even when the remainder is 0 because the function sigma is defined even for 0 over here. It may be easier to follow this with the help of an example like this. Okay, so we have proved that Gaussian integers form a Euclidean domain. In particular, I can calculate GCD using the Euclidean algorithm, and you should work out some examples like this. We just saw that Gaussian integers form a PID. So in particular, there is unique factorization. Let's try to understand the primes in this ring, called Gauss primes. we will see that there is nice interplay with divisibility in ordinary integers. First, some basic remarks. Suppose n is a non-zero integer and it divides this element in Gaussian integers. Then it has to divide the real and the imaginary part in ordinary integers. Next, an element A of Gaussian integers divides an element B implies that A bar divides B bar. This is because complex conjugation is a ring automorphism. In any UFD, it is useful to know what the units are. We have already seen that in Gaussian integers, these four elements are the only units. So you should check this again and note a consequence. If a Gaussian integer is an associate of its complex conjugate, then the only way it can happen is if the real part or the imaginary part is 0. So please check both of these things now. I have recalled the argument about units over here. Okay, we are looking for Gauss primes and ordinary integers are part of Gaussian integers. So it is natural to start with integer primes. How do they factor in Gaussian integers? Well, there are two cases. Either an integer prime p stays a prime or it factors. In the first case, note that p cannot be written as sum of two squares in integers, because if that were the case, then p would factor like this in Gaussian integers, contrary to assumption. Note that there are no trivial cases over here with k or l equal to 0, because p is also assumed to be an integer prime. So that leads us to case 2. Now I claim that p factors, but in a very specific way. I have started the proof by naming a prime factor of p. See if you can complete the argument. I have written down the proof and you should follow it carefully. Here are the main points. For the Gauss prime pi, its real and imaginary parts must both be non-zero. This is because pi is a proper factor of the integer prime p. Therefore, by this item, pi and its complex conjugate cannot be associates of each other. How do I use this? Well, since pi divides p, using complex conjugation, pi bar must also divide p. Now I just observed that pi and pi bar are not associates. So they must both occur in the prime factorization of p in Gaussian integers. So their product must divide p. But the product is a positive integer k square plus l square. So this positive integer must divide p in integers. But p is an integer prime. So p must equal k square plus l square, and I get this equality. Okay. Next, I want to see that this method captures all Gauss primes. In other words, if I start with a Gauss prime, either it must be an integer prime or a prime pi, as in case 2. See if you can prove this. We'll use the same tools as before. Unique factorization in Zi and Z, and passing from Zi to Z by multiplying by the complex conjugate. So let's start with the Gauss prime pi. I want to show that it comes from case 1 or case 2. So let's suppose I am not in case 1. That means that pi is not an associate of an integer prime. Looking at the units, that means that real and imaginary parts of pi, k and l, are both non-zero. Now let's look at pi times pi bar. That is the positive integer k square plus l square. I claim that this must be an integer prime and therefore I am in case 2. Why? Otherwise, this integer will have a factor p1, p2 in integers and therefore also in Gaussian integers. But pi times pi bar is the unique factorization in Gaussian integers. Therefore, there is no more room left and the list pi bar must be the same as the list p1, p2 up to associates and reordering. In particular, pi must be an associate of an integer prime, namely p1 or p2. But that violates my assumption and I am done. Take a positive integer n at the beginning of the course we asked when can n be written as a sum of two perfect squares. Now we have all the tools to answer this question. The key case to consider is when n is a positive prime p. In that situation, I have a clear dichotomy. If p is a Gauss prime, then it cannot be written in this form, and vice versa because of case 2. You should just check this quickly. Taking the contrapositive, I get the following. If I have a positive integer prime p, then it can be written as k square plus l square precisely when it is not a Gauss prime. This is a matter of simple reformulation, so pause if necessary and check this for yourself. Okay, but p not being a Gauss prime simply means it is not an irreducible element in Gaussian integers. Now Gaussian integers form a PID. So p not being irreducible simply means going modulo it, I do not get a field. Now I remember a bit of old magic. I know that this quotient is isomorphic to fpx mod x square plus 1. And I know quite a bit about quotients of polynomial rings. So using this, see if you can reformulate what we want further in an interesting way. We've seen that p is of form k square plus l square if and only if this quotient of the polynomial ring fpx is not a field. Fpx is a PID, so going modulo x square plus 1 is a field exactly when x square plus 1 is irreducible. We want the opposite of that. So the equivalent condition is that x square plus 1 should factor, and since it's a quadratic, it would need to factor into two linear factors. That just means that this polynomial has a root in Fp. So let's see for which primes p this happens. If p is 2, then 1 is a root just by inspection. So let's take an odd prime p and suppose that alpha is a root. That means alpha square is minus 1, which is not 1, and alpha to the power 4 is 1. That means that in the multiplicative group of all non-zero elements of Fp, the order of alpha is 4. Then this order has to divide the order of the entire group, which is p minus 1. So p must be 1 mod 4. Therefore, for an odd prime p to be of this form, it is a necessary condition that p must be 1 mod 4. But this condition is also sufficient. To prove this, you have to use a little bit of group theory, so see if you can do that. Take a prime p that is 1 mod 4. I want to find an element whose square is minus 1. Now minus 1 is the unique element of order 2 in Fp cross because it satisfies x square equal to 1. This is a quadratic polynomial, so it can have at most 2 roots, but it already has roots 1 and minus 1, so there are no others, and minus 1 is the only one of order 2. So I am reduced to finding an element of order 2 among the squares. So let's look among the squares. Take the square map from Fp cross to itself. This is an abelian group, so the square map is a group homomorphism. The size of its kernel is 2 because the kernel consists of only 1 and minus 1. So by the isomorphism theorem for groups, the size of the image is p minus 1 over 2, which is still an even number because p is 1 mod 4. So by Cauchy's theorem, this even cardinality subgroup has an element of order 2. But the elements of this group are precisely squares. So I got a square of order 2 and I am done. Two remarks about proving this last link. First, this proof uses both group theory here and also ring theory when we said that this quadratic polynomial can have at most 2 roots. And second, this equivalence can also be proved as a corollary of the following result. The multiplicative group of non-zero elements of any finite field is cyclic. This result is going to be essential for us while studying finite fields. Here, I can apply it to Fp cross. Because this group is cyclic, it will contain an element of order 4 if and only if the cardinality of this group, which is p minus 1, is divisible by 4. You should observe that this gives both directions for an odd prime. The proof of the cyclicity result again uses a nice combination of group theory and ring theory. So you should try it as an exercise. I have written here the final statements about when a prime and a general positive integer can be written as a sum of two squares. Note that the backward direction here is more interesting. It is harder to show that a prime like this can actually be written as a sum of two squares. In the forward direction, you can just consider this equation modulo 4 and derive these restrictions. You should check this. You should also do this characterization in the general case as an exercise. Here, it may be useful to consider factorization in Gaussian integers. For later use with finite fields, let's prove this interesting result. I mentioned a special case earlier. In any field F, any finite subgroup of F cross is always cyclic. Remember, F cross is the multiplicative group of all non-zero elements of F. We will use two distinct inputs. From ring theory, we get that for any n, this degree n equation x to the n equals 1 has at most n solutions in the field F. The group theory input is more serious. Suppose in an abelian group, I have elements G and H of finite orders K and L. Then I claim that there is an element whose order is the LCM of K and L. If K and L are co-prime, then this is easy. Just the product of the two elements works. Otherwise, I reduce to this case by taking suitable powers of the elements G and H. To find these suitable powers, it is useful to consider the prime factorization of K and L and then work prime by prime. So you should work this out. Okay, with these two in place, I have started the proof of the claim. See if you can finish it. I have taken n to be the LCM of orders of all elements of the group. So, using number 2, I get an element alpha whose order is exactly n. Therefore, the order of this element divides the order of the group. At the same time, the order of any element divides n. So, every element of the group satisfies x to the n equal to 1. Now, this degree n equation can have at most n roots. So, the number of roots that I already have must be at most equal to n. These two items together force the cardinality of G to be equal to n, and I already have an element of order n. So, I have a generator for the group. And I am done. This is a neat proof and it is worth understanding, including full explanation of the group theory part.